So if you ask our featured reader, Viet Thanh Nguyen, he'll tell you he's a butler to his son Ellison. We know better. He is an award-winning writer. His debut novel, The Sympathizer, won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize, as well as the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Fiction, the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and a whole host of other awards. We're so thrilled to have you here. Looking forward to your reading. He'll be in conversation with Swati Khurana. Swati is a writer, artist, and tarot reader. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, Guernica Magazine, and in the collection Good Girls Marry Doctors. She is also a founding member of the South Asian Women's Creative Collective. She lives in New York, where she is writing her first novel, editing flash fiction, developing a podcast, and daydreaming with her third grade daughter, Shalini. So, with that, I will turn it over to Viet, and thank you all again for being here tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffreen. Thank you, Swati, for being here with me tonight. Good evening, Asian American Writers Workshop. Such a pleasure to be here. Usually when I come to do these kinds of events, I talk about really serious things like, refugees and war and politics and all that kind of stuff. So it's really a great occasion to be here to talk to you about chickens and pirates. It's also really interesting because when I was a refugee and I came to this country, my salvation, as I was living this sort of lonely refugee childhood because my parents were out there working all the time, was the public library, and where I found refuge in books and stories. And I remember very distinctly when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I was in public school, and I created my own book. I wrote and I drew the book and bound the book, and it was called Lester the Cat. And it was about a cat, an urban cat, suffering from ennui. I didn't use that word back then, but anyway, that's basically what it was. Who runs off to the countryside to fall in love with a country cat. The end, okay? So it's really ironic and for me to see that my son, when he turned 4 years old, came up with a story about chickens. Also suffering, as you will see, from ennui. And they run off to become pirates. What that brings to mind is, yes, as an adult, I became a novelist and all that kind of serious stuff and everything. But the core of it all, in terms of being a storyteller, is the pleasure to be found in stories, in reading stories and in telling stories. And I thought it was really gratifying. What happened was I put out Lester the Cat to my third grade class or whatever it was. And then the public library of San Jose gave me an award for it, which put the thought in my mind that I could be a writer. And then that set me on the path to 40 years of misery trying to become a writer. Okay, so thank you, San Jose Public Library. My son has had it a lot easier, born into relative luxury. I only had books through the San Jose Public Library. We had no books at home except for the telephone book and perhaps the Bible. And he, Ellison, gets anything he wants, basically. We go to the library, get anything he wants. We go to the bookstore, he gets anything he wants. Because I want for him what I didn't have when I was a kid. My fantasy was to have any book I wanted. Was to have my own personal library. And thankfully, Ellison has turned out to be a reader and someone who loves books. And because if he didn't, I'm going to have to disown him. All right? So we spent a lot of time reading together, and that he seems to have picked up a love for books. And he also, like many children, is very creative. So without any encouragement from me, because I have no artistic talent myself, he started drawing and doing his own comic books. So he really loves comic books, superhero comic books, which I did too as a kid. And he was doing his own variations of Batman, Spider-Man, and Avengers, and all these other kinds of things by the time he was like 4 years old. He would staple pages together, draw these pictures, and come up with stories for them. But he was also reading children's books, of course, and one of the books that I gave to him that he really loved is a book. What's a book called? A Different Pond, by the poet Balfi, who I think has probably been out here. He's a great slam poet. And then he decided, Bao Phi, like me, had a child and basically got old, and so then did a children's book. And illustrated by T. Bui, who did the great graphic memoir, The Best We Could Do. Highly recommend all of their books. So Ellison really loved this book. And then when he was 4, I decided to take him with me to an art colony called the Jurassic Colony above Palo Alto. And while he was there, it was a retreat for Vietnamese American and Vietnamese diasporic artists and writers. And there he met T and Bao. And he had them sign his copy of A Different Pond. And I think he was so inspired by it that he, when he was there, came up with Chicken of the Sea, perhaps his first non-superhero comic book. And Chicken of the Sea is entirely his creation. I take no claim for this story, okay? And he drew all the pictures. He came up with the title. And I don't know if he ever even saw a TV ad of Chicken of the Sea or whether it was just like sort of floating out there in the ether and he was in his mind. And all I did was write the words down for him. And then I put that on Facebook just for fun because I'm a proud dad. And then a Facebook friend who I'd never met before, Christina Carnes of McSweeney's Publishers, messaged me and said, "Is this for real? Can we publish this?" And I said, "Of course. I will take every opportunity to monetize my son." Okay? Very, very expensive. And if you buy the book, you will see in the back that the original of Chicken of the Sea is reproduced there for you, along with a photograph of Ellison doing his thing. And of course, we couldn't really just reproduce the book and sell it to you for $15 or whatever the price is. We had to get some professional help here. So I asked T, would you be interested in drawing this book? And she said, well, I'm a little bit busy, but I have a very talented 30-year-old son. And so she showed me illustrations that Hien had. And Hien, read the comic book and understood the concepts. They all came up with sketches of chickens and pirates, and I thought, hey, this teenager is really talented. So that's what we decided to do. My part of it was to take the story arc of Chicken of the Sea, which, as you'll see, is still Ellison's, and come up with 30 or 40 lines for it. Which was actually not that easy to do because, I had spent my career writing short things and discovering I was really bad at them. So I started off writing poetry. Thankfully, I realized early enough that I'm a terrible poet. And then I started writing short stories because I thought, oh, they're short. They must be easy. No, they're not. And so then I finally wrote a novel, and that's my natural form. Give me 500 pages and I'm happy. But with Chicken of the Sea, I had 30 or 40 lines. And so after that was done, we turned it over to T and Hien. Hien drew the pictures, and then T came in and did the coloring. So we're going to show you a video tonight that will show you the whole sequence of how they did 2 of these pages. And with that, let me start off with the actual Chicken of the Sea itself. We're going to show you the book as a movie with musical accompaniment. The first time we did this in public, we had a live DJ providing some beats. So this movie has that, and then I will read the book. And I'm really sorry Ellison's not here because he's actually a really good reader. We read together, and he steals the show. Okay, it's really kind of sad. He gets much more applause than I do. And if you go to like Amazon.com or Goodreads, Chicken of the Sea has 5 stars. 5-star average. I don't have a 5-star average for any of my books. So he's doing much better than I am. All right, so here we go. Chicken of the Sea. Maybe you've eaten chicken, but have you ever lived on a chicken farm? We have, because we're chickens. Wake up, ruffle the feathers, peck, 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 lay an egg. Peck, 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 Go to sleep. We're bored. It's enough to drive a chicken cuckoo. But then, one dawn, cock-a-doodle-doo, the pitiless came. I need volunteers for my crew. Lost a few, as pirates do. Chickens, are you willing, or are you chicken? To be or not to be chicken, that is the question. So we became chicken of the sea, even if we can't swim. Goodbye, farm. Farewell, farmer. Hello, big blue sea. Now we pirates must do what pirates do. Steal treasure. And what is the greatest treasure in the world? A mountain of chicken feed. No. A nest of duck feathers. No. A beautiful sunny day. No. 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 The greatest treasure in the world is gold. And you know who has a mighty trove of gold? The Dog Knights. You may know what gold is, but we didn't, because we're chickens. So over the 7 seas we sailed, flying the black flag, through clear days and stormy ones. You may not know what seasickness is, but we do, because we're chickens. Then we saw it, through the fog, the castle of the Dog Knights. Now we wait for darkness. At nightfall, armed to the beak with heavy metal, we scaled the walls of the castle while the Dog Knights slept. Cock-a-doodle-doo! You old rooster, I'll put you in a stew before I'm through with you. As for the rest of you, show 'em no mercy. The clash of swords and sabers, the thunder of shot and shell, the smell of fear and ill, the flying of fur and feathers, the barking and the barking. And then, through the smoke, we saw the terrier, the king of the Dog Knights, and under his paws, our captain. Oh, the terror! The terror! Mercy! Mercy! Chickens, what say you? Mercy, we said. Mercy. It was then that the king's heart grew 3 sizes, maybe even 4. And so he threw a big party for his Dog Knights, and the pirates, and even the captain. A feast with everything except chicken. You're terrible pirates. That's because we're chicken! And that is a good thing. The end. I literally could never have come up with that story on my own. Yeah, so it was really cool. You know, my son has an agent. He's 6 years old. He has an agent. He has a literary agent. He has a film agent. Okay, so the literary agent has been asking for a sequel, right? And Hien wants to do a prequel. And these are all new vocabulary words for a 6-year-old. But the sequel, I came up with an idea. I said, how about we do Chicken in Paris? Because we've been to Paris quite a few times, and my son enjoys it. And so he said, okay, maybe we can do that. And I said, okay, well, the problem is the story will be set in contemporary Paris, but this story is set, obviously, in the age of the pirate ships. How do we get the chickens to Paris in the present age. And without missing a beat, he said, time machine. Okay, so you just can't beat that kind of imagination. It totally makes sense to me. So, it was a lot of fun coming up with the, writing the lines and everything. But of course, I have no artistic talent. We really needed T and Hien to draw and to color the book. So we want to show you a video now of their creative process. So Hien, the 13-year-old at the time, would sketch the picture. And then after that, T would come in and layer in the coloring. So you're going to see an entire sequence here. This is the final image, I believe. And it'll start with pretty much almost a blank page, and you just have to watch carefully as the castle is going to be drawn and filled in. That'll take the longest part. And then when the colors come in, everything will really, really pop. So let's run this movie of their creative process. Now you'll see the castle being drawn in the back. And there you have it, the artistic process for Chicken of the Sea. In all honesty, I think it was actually much more work for them to illustrate the book than it was for me to write 30 or 40 lines. My part in the process was done in literally like after I had time to think about what the story was. I wrote the lines in a couple of days, but it took them the entire summer, I think, to illustrate this book and then to do the coloring. And they did it on iPads, partly traveling through Greece at the time. And one last thing I'll say is, T has remarked that if she were to have done the illustrations herself, she would have done a lot of research into different breeds of chickens and all of that, And he just 13 years old, just went in and drew the chickens. So that's what you do. You don't have to do any research. Especially if you have children, nieces, nephews, whatever. Just let them do whatever their imaginations tell them to do. It was just an enormously rewarding process for me to spend some time with my son. We made a little bit of money, I think, off of this. Thankfully, he's not aware of the concept of money yet, so I just basically took it all. All right. Thanks very much. thanks for being here with me.
Thank you all for coming. We're so excited to see you. I wasn't going to ask you this question, but I couldn't. I was so struck with watching the video and watching you and then seeing you and the video and then the book cover of Maxine Hong Kingston, and I couldn't help but think about lineage. And I wanted to, and since we're at the Asian American Writers Workshop, I'm wondering if you could talk about how, literary lineage, community lineage, even hereditary lineage play a role in your work.
I'm Asian. It plays a lot of roles in my work, I think. Well, actually, coincidentally, I've done events with Maxine Hong Kingston, and just to give you a little bit of context, Maxine, I was a student at UC Berkeley, and Maxine was my professor there. And what happened was I came into Berkeley at 19 years old. I had no idea who Maxine Hong Kingston was. I knew she was famous. And then I got into her creative writing seminar, which is a class of 14 students. And I took it so seriously that I would come in and I would sit about this distance from Maxine, and then every single day I would fall asleep in the class. Okay, so we're going to talk about lineage. This is why, with my own students, if they fall asleep in my class, I don't get upset about it. Who knows what they'll turn out to be. And then last night I did an event where Jessica Hagedorn introduced me. And, I told the crowd, look, Jessica Hagedorn has been an inspiration to me for 3 decades, ever since Dog Eaters came out in about 1991, which I also read when I was at Berkeley. So reading the works of Maxine Hong Kingston, Jessica Hagedorn, and many others was enormously important to me because it wasn't that I hadn't thought about becoming a writer. It was just that it just gave me a different idea of what a writer could be. My idea of being a writer when I was 18 and going to college was Jane Austen. That's what I was into, So it was a totally different thing to encounter Asian American writers like Kingston and Hagedorn, or Toni Morrison, as we talked about backstage. And that kind of an education was really crucial for me to allow myself to think of myself as having at least 2, maybe 3 lineages. One lineage is the canonical Western one that I grew up with and what I was educated in. And then the other one was the Asian American and so-called minority American literary tradition in this country, which was enormously, that allowed me to think of myself as a writer, because I was coming from this refugee background where I was seeing my parents suffer, working 12 to 14-hour days. And it was really hard for me to go home to them and say, well, Mom and Dad, I want to study the Romantic poets, something like that. I had to be able to make a connection somehow between what I wanted to do as a writer and my sense that I needed to do justice to this world that I was coming from. And the Asian American and African American literary traditions really helped me to do that.
I was wondering if I was actually thinking about your parents and their shop, and I was thinking about how it must have been. It was a Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, and what a center of community that must have been. And I was wondering if you could talk about how it was for you there, and also I was wondering if you could about diacritics and just different community conversations or initiatives that you've been a part of that maybe some people here aren't aware of before the Sympathizer.
Yeah, so I grew up in San Jose, California in the 1970s and 1980s in a Vietnamese refugee community, and my parents opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store downtown. And at that, if you go visit San Jose now, you'll see dense Vietnamese shopping malls, and downtown itself looks kind of nice. But back then, there was very little Vietnamese businesses. And no one wanted to be in downtown San Jose, which was decaying, except for the Vietnamese refugees who had no choice but to open whatever business they could. So those were my parents. And they did the typical refugee immigrant narrative of suffering, as I mentioned, and sacrifice, which had a very deep emotional impact on me back then and still today when I think about it, what my parents had to go through. So I grew up with this sense that I had to talk about this community, and that's what I did in my short story collection, The Refugees. And what also was important was, I had such difficult memories of downtown San Jose and what my parents had been through that after I left for college, whenever I would go back to San Jose, I would just totally avoid downtown. I just couldn't go see it, you know. And then what happened was gentrification. And so, you know, again, nobody wanted to be in downtown San Jose, right? I remember walking down the street from my parents' store and seeing a sign in another window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." I was like, nobody wants to be here, dude, except the Vietnamese people. So ironically, Silicon Valley happens, all this money comes in, and then San Jose City Hall, San Jose government thinks, well, you know, we need a nicer city hall than what we have. Let's redevelop downtown. So they built a brand new city hall, beautiful city hall, not on my parents' store, but literally right across the street from my parents' store. So if you ever go to downtown San Jose and you stop in front of City Hall, just turn around, look across the street. That's where my parents' supermarket was. But of course, they forced my parents to sell their property in order to build the new home for the San Jose Symphony, which in some senses would have been great if they had actually done that, because I could point to that and say, "Oh, look, underneath your high culture, you know, structure lay the bones of my parents' store." But instead, they built. They put a parking lot on it, okay, for years and years. And now, apparently, the Chinese have bought it, and they're building a condo complex. So it's all part of the American dream, American story. My parents learned their lesson. They sued San Jose and won, so that was another lesson in their Americanization. And so, yeah, I thought it was really important to tell Vietnamese stories, and I felt that way ever since I was in college. So I've always been active in trying to promote Vietnamese artists and form Vietnamese arts organizations. Way back then, in the 90s, I and some others in the Bay Area, I created possibly the first Vietnamese American arts group. It's very melodramatic. It was called Mc Và Máu, which means ink and blood, okay? Eventually, it transformed into what we have now, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, much more palatable for, for arts funding. And I decided to create a blog called diacritics.org, just, you know, just because I wanted to. Just because I wanted to have a platform for Vietnamese diasporic writers and artists to publish and to talk about their work. And I just did it on a shoestring. We just did it on WordPress. I was the only person in charge of it. Nobody got paid, and that was the start of it several years ago. And what happened is that after I got a MacArthur Fellowship, I thought, okay, I don't need all this money. I need some of this money, but I don't need all this money. So I turned over $25,000 a year to DVAN to fund Diacritics, and now the writer Dow Strom is the editor for Diacritics, and we're starting to be able to pay people for that. So that's the ambition, you know, is to start from the shoestring, the community stuff, the stuff that you do at home just because you love it, and then trying to turn it into, like this, AAWW, and pay people in order to sustain the vision of nurturing and supporting artists.
That was great. Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk about hashtag Yangang.
Me?
Yes.
Okay.
I've been following some of your posts and some of your coverage. I mean, there isn't a lot in the media, which is something people have talked about. And I think might be, I don't know, maybe people in this audience might be interested in hearing your thoughts. And also, you know, I saw that you did post like something about that.
Any Yang Gang here? Oh, okay. Well, that's not what Andrew wants to see. Okay. Well, what happened was that I was asked to help to moderate a Democratic presidential debate in Orange County. I don't have no idea how I get dragged into these things, but it was me, Richard Louie from MSNBC, and another Asian American journalist, professional journalist, and we, you know, interviewed whoever was willing to come, which was not actually, it was an Asian American Democratic presidential event. So the only people who came were Tulsi Gabbard, Tom Steyer, and Andrew Yang, which shows you in what high regard presidential candidates think of the Asian American community. But Andrew came, and I did some, you know, my research on Andrew Yang, and you know, for those of you who don't know, I mean, he is and isn't the model minority at the same time, brown educated and all that kind of thing. But he left the tech world in order to embark on what could best be described as a, you know, as of 2 years ago, a pipe dream to run for president. I remember being told about him 2 years ago, and he's like, I don't know about this. But he's actually, again, on a shoestring, turned into, if not necessarily a top-tier presidential candidate, at least someone who's increasingly in the national conversation, introducing or promoting universal basic income, making it be a part of our vocabulary, so at least we can debate what that means and its benefits, and arguing that the biggest threat against us is automation versus immigrants. And of course, is Andrew Yang a representative for and of the Asian American community? That's for this context, an important question. And my question to him on the stage, one of my questions to him was, well, so what was it like for you to grow up as an Asian American? And I think it might have caught him a little bit by surprise, because maybe he's not asked that question very often, ironically. And in some ways that's a good thing, because I think part of the way to understand Andrew Yang's importance to us as Asian Americans is that he is Asian American. I don't think he's ever renounced that, but that what he's arguing about is not primarily Asian American issues. Now, some people may have problems with that, but the flip side of it is that given our ambiguous situation in the racial class matrix and hierarchy of the United States, we are people who are often perceived by others as being raceless, which is deeply problematic. But that might also be structurally our entree into a national conversation. That's politics. Literature, we haven't had that opportunity. We can't be raceless. It's been very difficult for us to be raceless in literature. I mean, our entryway into literature is to claim our race against racialization. But I think things might be changing because, if we talk about children's literature, young adult literature, Asian American authors are starting to make an impact here, but they're not necessarily writing about what high literary Asian American writing is focused on, which is refugee experience, immigration, culture clash, all that kind of stuff, which is important, but we've seen a lot of it. And so it's actually really cool that we have new Asian American writers who want to write science fiction and fantasy and romance novels that don't necessarily have anything to do with these historical matters. And I think that's actually really, really crucial in terms of thinking about what Asian American art might be.
I'm curious as to the number of hands of that surprised you, being that you're from California, because I think part of what's interesting about Andrew Yang is that so many of us, I don't know, I don't really have an opinion, but I was just curious if you'd see more hands at an event in California, or maybe about
no one's ever asked me, actually, so I have no idea. But at the presidential event, Andrew had the largest crowd of supporters because Yang Gang is pretty enthusiastic wherever he goes. So if you had billed this as an Andrew Yang event, this whole room would be filled to capacity.
Thank you, and definitely echo what Viet was saying about Asian American writers. I just saw that in Teen Vogue today, a friend of mine, Pooja Makajani, just published a piece about 12 new YA books featuring South Asian writers and characters. And that's just one genre and one group of Asian Americans. And so that is really exciting. What are some of the things you're excited about in terms of movies or podcasts or artists that you've seen, Asian, non-Asian, refugee, non-refugee, anything?
Well, I mean, speaking of like writers who are doing non-traditional things, I'm a big fan of Helen Hoang, who's Vietnamese American, but I read her novel, The Kiss Quotient, which is a romance novel. I have no objection to romance novels or anything like that, and it's deeply entertaining, and it's written from the perspective of a white woman who's autistic but high functioning. Okay, actually, I think it's not autistic; it's Asperger's, and she falls in love with a sexy, half Vietnamese gigolo, I guess is the best way to put it. And I'm all for that. Okay? It's like, because Asian American men have been complaining for a long time about our lack of representation, our emasculation, et cetera. And here comes Helen Hoang giving us the hot Asian stud that we always wanted. It's a very entertaining book. I recently tweeted about Anthony So, I think that's his name, right? Cambodian American writer who just published a short story in the New Yorker. 3 women and Chuck's Donut Shop, right? Chuck's Donut King, something like that. It's a great short story. If you haven't used up your New Yorker quotient, you can read it for free. And he's going to be big, I think. He's going to be big. So I think that, as a Vietnamese American writer, what I recognize is that although Vietnamese Americans, I think, have not been as visible on the literary scene in Asian America, partly because we arrived in 75 after other groups, we've caught up in a lot of ways. I mean, we have a lot of Vietnamese American writers out there. I know that because I've organized events where we bring 10 Vietnamese or Vietnamese diasporic writers to an event. All of them have books. We've done 3 of those events. We're doing a 4th one in Seattle. We're doing a 5th one in France this summer. You know, so that's at least 50 writers with books and national recognition in their various countries. So we've done fine. I'm not worried about Vietnamese representation. So to see, you know, Cambodian American literature starting to get this kind of recognition in the New Yorker, I wish they would have published one of my short stories, but whatever. You know, I'm perfectly happy that they're turning their attention to other Southeast Asians. So there's so much more that needs to be said about Southeast Asian experiences, from Cambodian, Laotian, Hmong experiences, and certainly we have those writers already as well. But it's great to see this kind of attention being paid to a young writer in the New Yorker.
Oh, yeah, that's really exciting. I know that, just to plug, I know that we're going to have Monica Sook's first book here at the Writers' Workshop. She's a Californian writer, California-based now, Cambodian origin writer. So I was struck when I heard that you said that the U.S. doesn't need an official ministry of propaganda because it's Hollywood that advances this kind of ideology, and that Hollywood producers already agree with the same ideology that inhabits the Pentagon. And I really connected to that a lot, especially with the incredible character of the auteur in The Sympathizer. And I was wondering if you could just maybe talk about the power of stories. And also, I was thinking about how history and politics are ghost stories. These were just themes I was thinking about when I was reading your books.
That's a big question.
I'm sorry. That was a really big question.
Well, you know, like all of you, I think all of us have been exposed to Hollywood movies. You just can't get away from it. And, you know, when I was a kid, I was watching Hollywood movies of all kinds and absorbing, without really realizing it, all kinds of ideology, from Western movies to, you know, heterosexual romances to, of course, war movies, and specifically Vietnam War movies, and became an American partly through watching all of these things and absorbing American culture. And that is the unofficial ministry of propaganda that I'm talking about. I mean, Hollywood does not have to make, you know, stereotypical Soviet-style socialist realism kind of stuff that nobody wants to watch. Hollywood has figured out that the quickest, easiest way to seduce people is to entertain them. And ideology slips in really easily in that way. So that's where I think American pop culture is so much better than Soviet or Chinese communist or Vietnamese pop culture. If we think about how Vietnamese pop culture, for example, one of the unintentional effects of how Vietnam's film industry has rendered the history of the Vietnam War has been that it's rendered it in a completely boring fashion. So the Vietnamese people themselves mostly don't want to watch these movies. They don't want to. So when Westerners come to Vietnam and say, oh, the majority of the population has been born under 1975, they're not interested in the past. That may be true, but they're not interested in the past because the past has been rendered completely boring by the propaganda. So it's a really unintentional effect. Maybe it's intentional. And the reverse is true for American pop culture. So, for example, I went to Italy, was interviewed on the radio by a communist who really loved The Sympathizer, was deeply opposed to American imperialism and the war in Vietnam, pro-Vietnamese revolution, and loved Apocalypse Now. And I was like, do you realize, of course, that in Apocalypse Now, the Vietnamese people are completely silenced, erased, et cetera, et cetera. And until I brought that up, I don't think it really registered for her. So this is part of the seduction of pop culture, that even people outside of this country who may dislike or oppose this country politically will still absorb an American perspective from what they consume culturally through music, movies, and commodity goods as well. And so the second part of your question about ghosts, I was growing up watching these kinds of war movies and stuff, and it was clear to me that America was still haunted by the ghost of the Vietnam War, whatever that meant to Americans. And that meant something different than what it meant for Vietnamese people. But we, in our turn, were haunted by the ghosts of the past as well, both the political and historical ghosts that you're talking about, of losing a country, losing your identity and all that, but also losing real people. Every Vietnamese family I knew had fled to this country as refugees, and everybody had left somebody behind. In the best of circumstances, those people were still alive in Vietnam. In the worst of circumstances, they were dead in a re-education camp or having been lost as refugees. So everybody I knew growing up was of my generation felt haunted by the past. Now each of us dealt with that differently. I became a writer to try to deal with it.
Textiles. I noticed in your Twitter bio you had, I don't know if the words are exactly right, but beneficiary of affirmative action, is that it? Could you talk about what that means to you?
Well, I'm literally a beneficiary of affirmative action. When I went to graduate school at Berkeley, I received, in the English doctoral program, I received a pre-doctoral minority fellowship. That's an affirmative action fellowship because, Asian Americans, and there are not that many of us in English doctoral programs. And partly that's the fault of structural racism, and partly it's the fault of Asian parents, okay? Discouraging us from pursuing these kinds of artistic pursuits. And so I just feel a need to proclaim it, obviously, because in the fraught debates over affirmative action that we have, Asian Americans are situated oftentimes as anti-affirmative action, and sometimes situate themselves as anti-affirmative action. So those of us who have benefited from it in whatever fashion, or those of us who believe in it out of an act of solidarity and out of an act of a conviction that we need affirmative action or programs like that in order to at least move one step forward in terms of social justice and economic justice, really need to proclaim that out loud. In the last few years, obviously the anti-affirmative action movement in Asian America has grown, led primarily, so far as I can tell, by Chinese immigrants, right? So who have not been a part of the Asian American tradition here, for those who have been here a generation or two. And going back to Andrew Yang, there was a recent article on him in I think it was The Atlantic, that said it's because of Andrew Yang's visibility that has led to actually a dialing down of the anti-affirmative action rhetoric in the Chinese immigrant community, because they see Andrew Yang, and then all of a sudden representative politics trumps whatever they themselves might have believed, because Andrew is pro-affirmative action.
Could you talk about those few days that you worked on the book, and what either how you went to embody the chickens and Ellison's narrative?
You assume a lot. I did not do the method, and try to get into the minds of the chickens. Maybe I just assumed that chickens are human. That they have their own subjectivity, so I don't have to get out of my own mindset as if the chicken is the other, right? They just behaved, It's like you had to find motivation for them and everything like that. But they were not to me weird or exotic. So I just accepted the premise of the book. We got chickens, we got dogs, we got rats, and they would behave, out of the basic human emotions of greed, of desire, of honor, these kinds of things. So it wasn't that difficult, actually. Maybe it would have been a better book if I'd actually gotten into the mindset of a chicken.
No, it was fantastic. So I think it was done perfectly. Is there anything that you wish people have asked you, or a question that you have had an answer for, maybe in the shower, you've just never gotten to say it aloud?
I'm a very shallow person. I like to talk about my hair. So if you want to talk about hair care products, how do I style my hair? I mean, I don't know about you, but I grew up, again, this Vietnamese refugee community of the 1970s and 1980s, and for young Vietnamese people, hair was everything. Hair was everything, And my transition into adolescence was, number one, getting rid of my really thick glasses that I'd worn since the second grade, getting contact lenses, and being able to do my hair, because my dad had been cutting my hair up until then. He didn't do the bowl cut, but it was pretty darn close. And so it was really important to discover mousse, gel, the hair dryer, and what every Vietnamese used. It was not Aquanet hairspray. It was something called foundation hairspray. It was like cement aerosol cement. You just like sprayed it on. And I had a lot of free time back then, so I would literally spend an hour in my hair every morning and get it to about 3 inches high. And I have photographic evidence of this, of me going off to college with my hair like 3 inches high. So I don't have the time for that anymore, but I still care about it.
Well, what's your routine now? What's your routine now? It looks fantastic. So
I am not a very masculine person, but I go to a very masculine barbershop in my neighborhood. And it's all men of color who work there, and mostly men of color who are the clients. And there's a particular vocabulary about fades and razoring in your part and undercuts and things like that. So I have the generic Los Angeles man of color hairstyle here, we use pomade. This is very crucial. You go to basically hairstylists oriented towards white people, they don't understand the concept. I was having problems because I wanted to look like slick and hard, and they would use like gel, and it just come out all kind of soft and floppy. I was like, that's not right. But men of color understand you got to use pomade, and that gives it a real shape that without the need for hairspray, so that saves the environment. Yeah. So, but the only drawback to that last word of caution is that if you sleep on it on a white pillowcase, it will ruin your pillowcase. So my wife is very upset with me for having ruined several pillowcases. Yeah.
Ellison also has great hair that I've seen on Facebook.
Yes, he has beautiful hair. In fact, he goes to the exact same barbershop. So when he was up until about the time he was 3, we would take him to Chinatown and take him to these very nice Vietnamese ladies. And they loved him because, they're all doing perms and everything. Then this very cute little boy walks in, and they call him Boy. And even after seeing him like 20 times. And they'll give him a nice, decent Asian boy haircut. And then, he'd have to take his shirt off and show his very rotund 2 or 3 year old body. They loved it as they dusted him off. But, at a certain point, I thought, okay, well, the environment that we live in California, you hang out with like Filipinos, Mexicans. The little boys care about their hair too, or at least their parents do. So they all have this kind of haircut and pomade and everything. So I took them to this barbershop. You have to understand, when you walk into this barbershop, it's a ritual to go around and greet all the barbers, but you don't shake their hands. You have to do this and this, and I'm terrible at it. I'm like I'm terrible. Because I grew up like a white person. But my son, he walks in, and they're like, Ellison, Ellison, Ellison. He mixed around, he does it. This is all natural. And then you got hip-hop music playing here. And I'm like, okay, there are all kinds of obscenities that are floating in the air and the hip-hop music and the way the guys are talking to each other. I'm thinking, he'll learn this eventually. It's okay. And so that's where he gets his haircut and style. Yeah.
That was so informative. Thank you.
That was the very first time I've ever talked about any of this stuff.
I mean, I actually would also love to talk to you about fashion, because I've also know that you're quite a connoisseur of suits and bespoke suits and good tailoring. And to me, that seems so Vietnamese and also so French, and so from Asian cultures that have tailoring within the culture.
Okay, so you know how like you grow up and you watch like James Bond movies, and they go, James Bond goes to the casino, he's wearing a tuxedo, it looks awesome and everything. Then you turn on the TV today and people at the World Championship of Poker look like they're driving trucks. I'm like, what happened? What happened? And of course we have champion Vietnamese poker players. We're really good at poker, and they do the same kind of thing, but with a Vietnamese flair to it. So the same thing with writers. I think the same thing with writers. American writers, they're slobs. Okay, when they go to these events and their literary readings, whatever. And I don't know what they're wearing. They just decided not to care about how they appear. And the only reason I'm dressed like this is because I know Asian American Writers Workshop is sort of like a family. We can be a little bit informal here. But for the last 3 nights, I've done 3 events before this, I've worn a suit every single night, okay? Because I feel that it's an event. It's an event when you go to a literary reading or a lecture, and I think of it as, a little bit of a performance, and I like to look nice. And also I need to have these suits because if I start to not be able to button my pants, then I know it's time to start to get back on the treadmill.
Well, I mean, I appreciated the blues that you had going and the pomade. And I loved what you had written in the New York Times recently with the launch of the book. And I'll just read a sentence from it. The act of writing requires writers to give enormous amounts of time and love. Writers must love their characters no matter what they do. My children are my characters, and I'm a character to them. They will tell stories about me. And I wondered I was going to ask Ellison if he were here. I didn't realize that he was coming. What story would you tell about your dad? So I'm going to ask you what you might think Ellison might tell about you.
That's a hard one. I mean, right now, I think all is good as far as I can tell, you know. Right now, he's 6 years old, you know. I don't think it's that, I mean, I'm maybe just being naive. I don't think it's that hard to have a good relationship with your child as long as you're financially stable and, you know, and you're emotionally stable and all that is under control and your health is good. After that, it's just you spend time with your child, you talk to your child. I try to talk to Ellison almost like an adult. I don't baby talk to him. We have very direct conversations and stuff, you know. Like he knew the word, he knew the word genocide at 3. He knew the word refugee at 4, you know. And you know, when you have children, for example, I want to be his father and his friend, but there's boundaries there. And so I have to say no. So, you know, he might have some resentments about that. So, for example, you know, you cannot give your child everything he or she wants. And when you're 4 or 5 or 6 years old, or at least my son, what he wants is Legos. Always asking for Legos. And I would have to say, no, you can't get that set or that set of Legos. And I ask him, do you know why you can't have those Legos? And he'll think about it for a moment, and he'll say, because you're a refugee? So he may remember that. You know, it's like, oh, my dad tormented me because he was a refugee, couldn't give it up, you know, was obsessed with it. And, you know, he wanted to pass that trauma on to me. All right. So that might be the kind of story he'll tell.
I think we can open it up, Tiffany. I don't know how we should do this.
I can actually go into the audience with my mic if you have questions. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
What's your next book gonna be about?
Thank you for asking that question. If I paid you, it couldn't have been a better question. As a matter of fact, I was just in my publisher's office this afternoon, and I have finished the sequel to The Sympathizer. So we're in the editing stage of it. They showed me covers today, so it's real, you know. They told me not to tell people what the publication date is, but it will be in the very near future. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Hi. I was just wondering, I have a niece and I have a nephew, and I don't see too many Vietnamese American children's books out there, so it's really cool. So I'm just wondering if you have suggestions for Asian American, Vietnamese American children's books out there. I only know of 2, which is this one and A Different Pond.
Well, I just recently read Kaukalia Yang's book. Kaukalia Yang is Hmong American. She's written a couple of very serious books, The Late Homecomer and The Song Poet, both of which are great. I really recommend them. But then she wrote a children's book called A Map into the World, which is about a young Hmong child and living in Minnesota, where Kaukalia Yang lives. There's actually quite a bit of Asian American children's literature. I think Alan, does anybody know his name? Chinese American writer of children's literature, Alan said? How do you spell it? S-A-Y? Yeah, he has a lot of, he's like of an earlier generation. And actually there's no shortage of, I think, Asian, at least Chinese American children's literature. I'm sorry, you asked about Vietnamese, but that talks about history and all that kind of thing. And I just want to make a pitch. If any of you want to write children's books and stuff, it's cool to have books that deal with our history and our culture and our customs and stuff. But sometimes you just want chickens. Okay, that's also kind of crucial as well. And then to finally answer your question, I'm trying to think of other examples of Southeast Asian children's literature besides that, and I'm just drawing a blank, which means you got to write one, right? Yeah.
Could you talk about writing across differences or writing the other in light of the controversy over American Dirt?
Everybody knows the American Dirt controversy. Okay. Well, I mean, I think for those of us who are people of color or for any kind of minority group, when we see these kinds of issues coming out, I think we implicitly understand, hopefully, that it's not anything as reductive as the way some in the media are portraying it, or some booksellers are portraying this as an act of cultural appropriation or censorship when we respond. Because really, I think what's at stake here is not cultural appropriation. I don't know. I mean, like all the Latinx critics of American Dirt have never said, like non-Mexicans in this case can never write about Mexicans. Okay, what they're saying is, you can't do it badly without expecting a response from us, because it's been done so badly so many times before. We're just fed up with it. So what does it speak to? It means that cultural appropriation, what really triggers people's anger, is that it's economic appropriation to begin with. You know, it's like these centuries and centuries of colonization and stealing people's land and resources, etc. And then the cultural appropriation is just a cherry on top that really just gets everybody upset. And so that's why I think the controversy over American Dirt is about publishing. The inequalities in American publishing, corporate publishing, are a direct consequence of these centuries of colonization and appropriation and racial inequality. And then finally, the censorship issue. I think, you know, part of the effect of colonization is censorship. I mean, people like Latinx people have been censored in the United States, in effect, as the norm for decades. And so when they speak out against this normative censorship, they're accused of censorship by people like Stephen King. You know, so it's sort of a reverse racism charge. It has the same kind of meaning. For me, there's a couple of implications for this, which is that, you know, those of us who are writers really believe that representations matter. We got to tell our stories, et cetera, and of course we do. But we're not going to achieve justice in storytelling without also achieving justice in economic equality in things like controlling the means of production and representation. So that's a whole other battle that has to take place. Because if we don't control that, we're not going to be able to control things like the marketing and who gets picked as an author and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, the issue of appropriation is important for any writer, because we're always appropriating. We're always writing about people we don't know, and it's not always just people of another culture, right? So we always have to do our homework about these kinds of things. And so there's a question about, you know, how do you do that? And the author of American Dirt has said, well, I did 4 years of research and all this kind of stuff, but apparently it was the wrong kind of research. And, you know, as much as I object rhetorically to the idea of sensitivity readers in the literary industry, which is apparently something the young adult industry does, there is some validity to that notion that you should at least get people who are familiar with that experience to read it and give you feedback. You know, I prefer, my colleague Doreen Kondo has a book called World Making, in which she talks about critical dramaturgy, because she is a playwright and an anthropologist who was a dramaturge for Anna Devere Smith. Okay, and I think that's a much more useful model. I don't like sensitivity; that's not my thing. I like critical. And in the critical dramaturgy model, you get people from different disciplines and different disciplines to read your work, but also people of the background that you're writing about. So you get a critical take on what you're doing. And that's what I try to do with the sequel to The Sympathizer. It's called The Committed, and it's set in 1982 in Paris. And I have a lot of trepidation writing about the French. And it deals with colonialism and racism, and the French have a completely different attitude towards these issues than Americans do. And the French of Vietnamese descent have a completely different take on this than I do. So I'm walking into some, perilous territory, but I've had, hopefully, I gave the manuscript to people of French folks or French-speaking people of Moroccan, Algerian, and Vietnamese backgrounds to try to get their responses to this. Am I getting the details right of 1982 Paris? How am I dealing with the depiction of race and cultural difference in France? I'm not expecting them to agree with me, but at least to tell me, okay, you got the details right, and at least you have a viable perspective here that's being advanced in this book. So that's my way of trying to address the potential charge of cultural appropriation in my own work, and then we'll just have to see what the French say when the book comes out there. Yeah.
Hi. I have an 11-year-old collaborator, and he's actually the one who told me about this book because he's working with my team on a piece of chicken-related programming also. So he was excited about it. And something that I keep running into with institutions and I'm curious about is what kind of steps do you think we need to take, maybe speaking from literature, but other fields as well, to understand people of that age, of that kind of age range as generative artists?
I have no idea. My only response to working with my son, who was 4 to 6 during this time period, and Hien, who was 13 to 15, is to approach them on their own level. You know, so like I said, I try not to talk down to them. I just assume that they can understand what I'm talking about, you know, and respecting his vision. His vision was chickens. And we had many conversations about this as I tried to adapt his work. I said, so what if we do this? He said, no. What if we do that? He said, no. And that's okay, fine. I'm not going to. So, I mean, when I say that his story, it's really his story because I respected the arc that he did. I didn't try to change the elements of the story. And after I wrote the script for it, we went over it line by line. I read it with him, and I said, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And he said, fine. You know, I think the only thing that he wanted that did not appear in the book was that he wanted the farmer. If you remember, there's a farmer on the farm, right? He wanted the farmer to come along on the pirate ship. And I just don't know how to. I told him I just don't know how to put the pirate. This is a tangent, dude, and I just can't figure out how to include this. So we should cut it. And I said, okay, he's fine. So I think that's, you respect their artistic vision, you respect their creative vision, and you do not try to come in and say, I'm an adult, I'm the professional here, and here's what we really need to do. Okay, so that's sort of a Hollywood mogul style of giving notes. And when you're, you know, you could do it, but it's better, you know, to let them have their imagination run free, because their imagination is in many ways better than our imaginations.
Thank you. I just had a really quick question. I'm curious about what you think about children's books or children's writing as a medium. I thought it was interesting that you made like kind of saw them on opposite sides. Like you talk about your work and, you know, refugees and talk about war and migration and things. And then you have like the lightness of chickens and the frivolity and the kind of playfulness of that. And I'm just wondering what you think about that as a medium to deliver a kind of more powerful political message, and if you think there's potential to do that.
I think actually that's the norm at this moment. You know, there's been a boom in so-called multicultural children's literature, right? I think obviously the world of children's publishing, as far as I can tell, is pretty aware that there's a need to address diversity, whatever that happens to be. And so I don't think there's actually a shortage, as far as I can tell, in general, of books that deal with African American or Asian American experiences or gay experiences. Now it's a matter of like narrowing down. So, you know, with Kathy's question, not just generically Asian American or Chinese American, but what about Vietnamese and Cambodian and so on and so forth. So and it is already implicitly political, because, you know, when I was growing up, we had like Curious George. You know, it's like, well, it's kind of racist, you know, in retrospect, but it was still fun. But, you know, now children's literature is actually much more sophisticated. But I have an issue here, which is that I think it's absolutely important. Obviously, the idea of reflection is important, that aesthetic of reflection. So we should read literature and see ourselves in it, which is important in a sense that we can affirm, you know, oh yes, there were Vietnamese refugees, or oh yes, we like to eat mooncake or whatever. But it's also very literal as well. And that's, I think, the potential drawback. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have works that are realistic and should address history and implicitly therefore address politics, but that there is a potential aesthetic problem there that concerns me, that if that's all we do, then that's really boring. So that's why I was really thrilled that Ellison came up with this story, which on the surface I don't think has anything about ethnicity or culture or politics or anything adult like that. And I think that's great. And there's that dimension of the imagination that children have before they've been racially formed right? That's crucial for us. So there has to be some negotiation between these two opposites. I think about, okay, one of my son's favorite books series is Dog Man. All right, if you haven't read Dog Man, I wish I had it when I was a kid. It's a very smart series that veers between high literary illusion and fart jokes. Okay, my son loves the fart jokes, and then I explained to him, the literary illusions. Like the last installment of Dog Man is Fetch 22, and see, it's great, it's awesome. And the one, and by the way, if you don't know Dog Man, it's about a dog and his policeman partner, and they get blown up in a bomb, and then they get put back together. Dog head, human body. Okay, but the dog is smarter than the man, so it all works out. So Fetch 22, Lord of the Fleas, Brawl of the Wild. It's awesome, So there's an example of sort of like untrammeled imagination. And we also need some of that for our so-called, multicultural literature as well. Yeah. So, yes, do your good act of representing your people and put in some fart jokes in your children's literature as well. Okay.
So you mentioned about emasculation of Asian Americans in literature, right? And so what do you think would be the best approach for you as an Asian American writer to, approach that? Not necessarily solving it.
Well, I brought up Helen Huang, and Helen does stuff I can't do, which is write explicit sex scenes. I mean, they're hot, everything's in them. So that's one way. And that's like that's a straight up affirmation of the beauty of the Vietnamese American man. I'm all for it. But I was very conscious of this issue of the representation of Asian American and Vietnamese masculinity and so on. So in the Sympathizer, I wanted to create a very masculine character. I imagined him as a bad James Bond. All right. So he gets a lot of sex. He has a lot of ladies, all that kind of thing. But going back to this idea of the fart joke, I undercut it by making him also a deeply problematic character. So he's got no problem consorting with women and getting women and all of that. But he's also, an alcoholic, a womanizer, a liar, a murderer, a spy, all the good stuff. And so that's what I'm saying. It's like the idea that we have to be literal-minded in terms of positive representations, whether it's at the level of children's literature or so-called adult literature, is really, to me, unimaginative. And we have to think about the fact that if you're a part of the majority, part of the privilege of being a majority is that you have no sense of responsibility. You can do whatever you want, right? But we, as minorities, oftentimes, for better or for worse, feel a sense of responsibility to our community, to our history, whatever it is. And so then we have to give a good representation, right? That's while that's crucial, we also have to think about how we can make that more complex by mixing the good and the bad at the same time, just to use these very reductive terms. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Last question.
Last question.
First of all, thank you so much, Anh Nguyen Thanh Viet, for this amazing experience to hear about your story. I have a curiosity. So we have a lot in the Vietnamese representation of, lawyers and so on, but not a lot of, writers. And so how and who helped shape you into this? Because a lot of families and Vietnamese family during that time of refugees really steer their kids to lawyers, doctor, whatever, but not in writing. So it takes, what was the catalyst that helped you to shape you? And not only that, but social justice and all the movement that you have started. I'm very curious. Thank you.
Well, my parents were the stereotypical Vietnamese Catholic parents. If you know anything about Vietnamese culture, you know that it is deeply hierarchical and authoritarian. And if you know anything about Catholic culture, it's deeply hierarchical and authoritarian. So imagine that. That was my environment growing up. But my parents were, I would say, benignly neglectful. I mean, their attitude was, okay, you're gonna get food, bad clothing, terrible food, but a lot of it, and religion and education, and then we don't have to talk about anything else. So their attitude was, we give you all this kind of stuff. Of course, you'll become a good person, by whatever they meant by that. And of course, you'll become, you'll get a job and all that. And I don't think it ever occurred to them that I could become a writer. I mean, they looked at my brother. My brother was 7 years older, and he came to this country at 10 years of age without English, and then 7 years later graduated as valedictorian of his high school, went off to Harvard, and then just to rub it in, went to Stanford Medical School too, which is what you're supposed to do when you're Asian. And so, I mean, literally, he was featured in the San Jose Mercury newspaper and profiled on TV when he graduated at 17 or 18 as the Vietnamese refugee success story. Even years later in college, people would come up to me and say, dude, my mom made me read about your brother, So my parents had that, and I think they just assumed I would do the same thing. So when I was roundly rejected by every single Ivy League college, my dad was pretty upset about that. But they were benignly neglectful. And so that was just some kind of weird circumstances where benign neglect meant that they didn't tell me what to do. So after school, I would just go to the library and get books. The weekends, I would be left alone. I'd go to the library and get books. And here's another thing about my parents. They didn't want me to become a shopkeeper. So the other thing they did was that they did not make me work in their grocery store. I had to do it a couple times, but it was not the stereotypical story where the kid is punished by having to live in that grocery store all the time. So I got to go home and just read all the time. And I think the fact that my parents were deeply Catholic and I had a Catholic education my entire life, but that I was an atheist shaped me too. Because I don't know why I was an atheist. I mean, I was constantly exposed to Catholicism. I should have believed, but it didn't work, But what worked was I absorbed Catholicism culturally. By that I mean, I like pain and sacrifice, and I believe in justice. So I absorbed the social justice vision of Catholicism, right, without the actual religion part of it. And so that's why I became not just an atheist, but a Marxist. So the Sympathizer is in many ways an exploration of of belief between Catholicism and communism. It's partly about people who believe. It doesn't matter what their ideology or religion is. They just need to believe in something. I think I needed to believe in something, and it turned into social justice. So when I got to Berkeley as a college student, I immediately became radicalized because it gave me the secular language of justice that I yearn for instead of the religious language. And that mixed with the fact that I love books and stories and that was my salvation, turned me into a writer. And so there's no programmatic way of doing this. I don't think my son, just because he's done this, is going to become a writer. In fact, he says, I don't want to be a writer. I want to be an inventor. And I'm fine. I'm not going to get in your way. I think the only, I don't, Kathy, you may have a different opinion, but, I when I was growing up, I read an account like in the newspaper. It said, all good writers are traumatized. They've all undergone something terrible. There's something wrong with them. And naive me, I read that and I thought, well, I can't become a writer. Nothing's wrong with me. But in fact, that background that I just told you about totally screwed me up. It just took me decades to figure out how much. And then as a writer, I had to go back into that history. And people ask often, how do you become a writer? And my answer is suffer. Suffer originally, and then suffer some more for the art, and then be willing to go to where it hurts. Because, at least for me, that's what it took to write anything that was worthwhile. So this is why I'm not joking when I said when I got that library prize, it set me on to 40 years of misery. Because that's what it entails, Now, there's if you're a Catholic, you believe that there's pleasure in pain, and you better believe that I think that writers are masochists because I think there is some dimension of the fact that we know it's painful, but we have to keep doing it over and over and over again, just like a good Catholic. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Viet and Swati. Let's give them another round of applause. There are books for sale. We have Chicken of the Sea for sale by Greenlight in the back. Thank you so much. Feel free to mingle.
Ellison could not be here to sign books, but he has signed book plates to put into your books if you choose to buy them.